Good morning, everybody. I had asked them to put up what I thought would be enough chairs so that I wouldn't have to keep putting up chairs during the lecture. We are so fortunate to have Dr. Art Echerd back at Westminster. Many of you have known him from the classroom. He said, looking out, there are two generations of alumna that he sees out here, so that's a really good sign. I want to say a word of thanks to Fran Lindley as well, who helped arrange this, and I'll ask Fran to introduce Art. There are seats, perfectly good seats on the front row, I would add. These are prime real estate seats down front here, so please do not be afraid. Fran?
All right. Dr. Echerd, whom he continues to tell me to refer to as Art, and I decades in still struggle with that. Art, many of you know and needs no introduction, but for many of you, you may not. He has shaped young women's minds for a very long time here in Nashville, being a European history and world history expert and professor for, do we want to say how many years? I said 30 plus. 38 years he's been doing that here in Nashville. And so we have many who have experienced him. I've purposefully asked him to come do this in a rather selfish way. I pulled out, I think a lot of you all were here, but I pulled out the covenant that we brought out last Sunday. Dr. Echerd is an important part of this whole process that we're going through in my world and in many of our worlds. I think that Westminster does such an amazing job of learning and acquiring knowledge. And we know through our covenant with God, we know that that's what transforms. That's what reconciles. That's how we share the light and love of God with others. Art does such a wonderful job, not only of imparting this knowledge, which he has up in there in ways that I can only fathom accomplishing in my world, but he does it without judgment. He does it with respect, and he does it with a view to our taking that knowledge and doing with it as we need in our desire to bring it forward and out into the world. So he has plenty to impart. I'm going to be quiet. This is one of 4 Sundays, everybody. So get cracking, but you do have term lists. He'll make it through like 6 of these, and then we'll have to hit 100 miles per hour and keep going. But you've got your term list. Please, please feel free to ask me if you need any one of these documents, and I'll be happy to share with you. But without further ado, thank you so much for being here, Dr. Art Echerd.
Okay, I hope, first of all, the sounds everyone can hear fine, because and I have a tendency sometimes, particularly near the end, the last 10 minutes, I'm going to try to have time for questions. I will have time for questions. And I usually will walk away to hear the question because my hearing's going, that's okay. So you might need to remind me to come back here to the microphone after I do that, because I'll just stand there and keep talking. I mean, I found that out at Winter for Adults classes that I've done at Harpeth Hall. And when you do it, then you leave the screen, everything when they're taping it. But yes, 4 Sundays to talk about as complicated issue as I can think of. I didn't even think about the complications of it, of trying to in any way be impartial, objective, which I think is ultimately impossible in a sense of being completely objective. The very fact that you talk about some things and not other things already injects an element of subjectivity, if you think about it. But I will try to be as impartial as I can on this question, which is, like I said, so contentious. I just heard coming in on the radio driving in about this dispute at the New York Times. How many of you know about this, that supposedly there was a real dissension within that newspaper about coverage of particularly the original attack and all. And so just, it's on and on. And I was even thinking about, obviously, the fact that I have this flag up here. may seem to indicate that I'm going to be seeing all this from the Zionist point of view or something, but it is such a striking image. It's one of the best design flags, I think, in the world, however you feel about the question of Zionism. And I'm going to talk about how it's one of the most recognizable ones. And I will talk about how it was evolved, really. But this question obviously is one where you have to go back in time, maybe way back in time. And it's a standing joke at Harpeth Hall that anytime anyone asks me a question, whether a student or a fellow teacher, that I always answer by saying, okay, we need to go back, several hundred years. They always just want an immediate answer about something, a contemporary issue. And I'm talking about something that happened 1,000 years ago. But it always reminds me of my favorite quotes about this question of, when does the modern age begin? It was a modern British historian who said, when he was asked that question, he pondered it for a long time. And he said, I finally decided that modernity starts either 1 or 2 days. He said, it's either the call of Abraham or the Great Reform Bill of 1832, and which, if you know anything British history, it's a pretty important date, but and I kind of feel that way at times. But I am going to talk a little bit about just the nature of the Semitic people and the origins of Israel, because you really have to know that. I mean, both sides in this issue, of course, claim that this is their land. And it really is a question of conflicting claims that I think, it's either a question of right versus right, or some people might say wrong versus wrong, but I personally don't think it's clear cut. Obviously, there are people on both sides who think it's completely clear cut, but I always think about, what should I start with? Because this in some ways is what I maybe need to end with on the last Sunday. But the question about the Jewish population in the world and how the demographics has changed just remarkably in the last century, really half century, you might say, about where Jews live. We're pretty certain that after the original Babylonian captivity, when Nebuchadnezzar, took the Jewish people in like 580 BCE, took them into the Babylonian captivity, took them to what's now, Iraq, basically, that when the Persians took over and let them return under Cyrus, that a fair number of the Jewish people, the Israelites, whatever, did not go back to the Holy Land. And in fact, probably starting that far back, the majority of Jews in the world have not lived in their Holy Land. But that's probably going to be true in just a few more years, that the majority of Jewish people, for the first time since the 500s BCE, will be living there again. Because you can see here, for a long time, most of my lifetime, the largest Jewish population in the world was in the United States. But you can see, according to this chart, which is a few years old, there are now more Jews living in Israel than the United States. They are still not over half the population, the Jewish population of the world, but they probably will be pretty soon. And that's a kind of remarkable fact, considering for how long, for over 2,000 years, Jewish people were dispersed around much of the world. And one thing that worries them, certainly, is that their survival at times over the centuries was survival by dispersion. If Jews were persecuted in some part of the world, which they almost always were somewhere in the world, usually in some part of Europe, then they were perhaps safer somewhere else, so they could flee somewhere else. And that kind of spread. And I guess start with the terms here. Does everyone have a copy of it somewhere? Because I know we've got lots of them. Yeah, there's some back there. I think she's going to hand them out. The diaspora, which literally means the scattering, the sprinkling, is a term that I think most of y'all are familiar with. It means Jewish people living outside of the Holy Land. And I'm saying the Holy Land because, of course, even the name of this place is contentious. I wrote on there, Canaan, the oldest name, Israel, Judea at times it's called in history, Palestine, which is a term that really starts with the Romans in some ways. So maybe just calling it the Holy Land is the simplest way to do it, because it is a holy land for the 3 great Abrahamic religions, the 3 great Semitic religions. I mean, one reason why this question is so emotional is that roughly half of humanity is a member of a religion that thinks this is the holiest place on earth, or close to the holiest. For Muslims, Jerusalem is the 3rd holiest city in the world. You probably know that. Mecca and Medina obviously are the holiest, which are not that far away, but for Jews and for Christians, it's that one small little area. The city of Jerusalem, someone once described as being saturated with emotional significance. Might say it's overdosed on emotional significance to so many people. But if for most of history, more Jews have lived in the diaspora, in the community outside of Palestine than in it. That obviously speaks to this question. But now that's starting to end. As one Jewish commentator said, most of the diaspora now, he said, is either a museum or a cemetery. That if you go to certain parts of Europe, particularly, there's a tiny Jewish communities hanging out in some places. But the heart of the Jewish world, up until the middle of the 20th century, was really Eastern Europe, mainly in what's now, Poland, Belarus, the Baltics, Ukraine, mainly inside what was then the Russian Empire, but now they're mainly in those independent countries. But that ended with the Holocaust. And by the way, with these numbers, the Jewish population of the world today has still not recovered to what it was in 1939. And the percentage of the Jewish population in the United States is something that I think now a lot of them are more concerned about in a way, because does anyone have a rough idea of what percentage of the American population identifies as being Jewish? It's about 2%, probably less than 2% now, actually. Probably the highest it was right before I was born, probably in the early 1950s, because most of the Jewish immigration that came to the United States had arrived by then. And the birth rate of Jews has generally been lower than the average American birth rate. Plus, we also have immigration from a lot of other sources that aren't Jewish and so on. So the percentage, which even then was less than 3% of the American population, has been dropping. And again, I thought about maybe not talking about this Sunday, but let me go ahead and talk a little bit about it. This question of, will Jews virtually disappear through just assimilation? Because when I was the age of the students I'm teaching right now, when I was a sophomore in high school, only 8% of marriages in America that involved a Jewish person were mixed marriages. It was overwhelmingly you married a fellow Jew. And of course, you had tremendous pressure, usually from your parents, find a nice Jewish boy or a nice Jewish girl, of course, they're not the only community that did that, but I think they felt a special pressure to do that, to be honest. Now, over half the marriages in America involving a Jewish person is a mixed marriage. And only 1 out of 4 of those marriages do they raise the children as Jews. So, as one rabbi put it, we are finishing Hitler's work. And again, obviously we're outsiders looking in on this whole question, but the question of assimilation and birth rates and things like that, a lot of people who believe in Zionism say Israel has to survive because that's about the only place where Jewish people won't just disappear through assimilation, if nothing else, not just from, genocide. I need to go back and look at the particulars of it, but I remember back in the 1990s, and I was already in Nashville, there was a dispute at the synagogue, and it wasn't an Orthodox synagogue, I think it was a conservative synagogue, over a rabbi who would not perform a marriage of a member of that congregation. Some of you probably know better than I do, who was marrying a non-Jew. And the rabbi just said, look, because of the things I was talking about, we have to perpetuate our people, and you're doing something that I just cannot endorse. I mean, I don't think he tried to guilt trip them too much, but he just said, I'm not going to do it. And it split the congregation, though, because there are a lot of people who thought that was very un-American, here you marry for love and all this sort of thing. But, I was pretty sympathetic to his point of view. Again, outside I have no right to tell him what to do, but his point was these statistics, certainly the Middle Eastern world, other than Israel, is now almost completely emptied of its Jewish population. And not through massacres generally, but in the Middle Eastern world, particularly the Arab world, Jews left after Israel was created, partly because there was even more enmity towards Jews because of Israel's, it's sort of a vicious cycle. But you all know there were vital, important, long-standing Jewish communities in places like Yemen, and Alexandria and Egypt, and Baghdad certainly had a very big Jewish population, Morocco, and they're all pretty much gone. Israel actually airlifted a lot of those people out at different times. And so, not to, the Nazi phrase for all this is Judenrein, which means cleansed of Jews. But one way or another, and not generally through massacres, the Middle Eastern world does not have those Jewish communities anymore. And, we've already talked about, obviously, Eastern Europe, same sort of situation. So I know I sound like I'm making the case for Zionism, but you have to see, that point of view. There is another side to all this, of course. The Palestinians would say, well, no, that's our fault. I'll go ahead and tell you, they often make the point when people say, well, the Jews need to have their own country to be safe, and that they suffered the greatest crime, perhaps, of human history with the genocide. But a Palestinian, of course, would say, then why don't you carve a Jewish state out of like Bavaria? We didn't do that. It was European Christians or post-Christians who did it. And see their point of view. But this is a map about the Semitic people. And I don't have anything written on your list about that exactly, but that Semitic is a legitimate term as a language category. The word anti-Semitism, though, I think I'll go ahead and talk about that a little bit, which is usually when my students, when I ask them what is Semitic, they know the word anti-Semitism. They don't know the original meaning of the word. But it's a language category that you can see that's over much of the Middle East. Arabic is obviously by far the most widely spoken. Can y'all see that very well? Yeah, I guess you can. Semitic language. Some of the languages of Ethiopia, particularly among the Christian communities in Ethiopia, like Amharic, is a Semitic language. The ancient cultures that now don't have a distinct identity more, but like the Assyrians were Semitic people, the Chaldeans were Semitic people, the Phoenicians were Semitic people. But today, of course, the two most important Semitic languages, really, at least if you don't count Ethiopia, is Arabic and Hebrew. And they are relatively similar. In some ways, of course, this is a battle that's almost fratricidal, or, battle of country cousins. And I don't speak Arabic or Hebrew, but I do know the word for peace in Arabic and in Hebrew and how similar they sound. I think y'all know them. In Hebrew it's shalom, in Arabic it's salam. Very close to the things that they don't tend to have among themselves now. Jerusalem, the original origin of that name of that city is probably have to do with a pre-Jewish pagan god, actually. But eventually people began to say that Jerusalem could mean the city of peace, because it's sort of related to the word shalom, which again is ironic because it's such a contentious place now, or has been. The word Israel means one who has striven with God and with man and has prevailed. The word Jew comes from the word from Judah. And often Jewish people, even now, will refer to the Eretz Israel, which I don't think I have that on here either, but just means the land of Israel. When the modern Israel was created in 1948, there was actually a debate right up until the very moment it was declared to be an independent country about what are we going to call our country. Because some people wanted to call it Judea, some people wanted to call it Palestine, even. Eventually, of course, they settled on just Israel, but some people said we should call it Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. But I guess moving along, I need to, since I got to get to the 20th century today, which I probably won't, but I think all of you know that we're dependent for a lot of the history on what we call the Old Testament. There are people who question, obviously, the historical veracity of some of these accounts, but some of the history of the Bible, certainly, it's amazingly confirmed by archaeology. And I'm not a biblical archaeologist and all, but we do feel like it seems pretty certain there was this kingdom of Israel, which only lasted for a couple of generations, David and Solomon, and then it split after Solomon's son, Rehoboam, was heavy-handed in his rule, and there was this split. This occurred that the southern tribes set up a kingdom here with the capital of Jerusalem, and the kingdom of Judah, and then the kingdom of Israel was up here in the north with Samaria as its capital. And so, of course, Jewish people always make jokes about how contentious they are among themselves. I think it's a sign of vitality in a lot of ways. It's like the ancient Greeks, the same way. The Greeks could never unite, but they were incredibly fruitful and culturally speaking. But Jews like to say, if you have three Jews together, you'll have four different opinions, and that, I mean, it's a cliche, but, there were stories like that about the ancient Greeks too. If you get like three, particularly Athenians, if you get three Athenians together, you'll have four different opinions. But they divided, and this is back in around the year 900 BC. And then the northern half was conquered in the 700s. These are the so-called lost tribes of Israel by Assyria, which was the great expansionist empire in the ancient world. And I think I have one more map that's sort of showing some of this. Yeah. And the fate of those people, we're not certain what happened to them. Mormons are certain. They say that they're the Native Americans. That's what the lost tribes of Israel ended up over here. But we're not Mormons here, so we won't we won't go any further with that. But I want you to see this more clearly here, which is the Philistines, because obviously that's where Gaza is right now. You can actually see the city of Gaza. Ashkelon, which is still a city, this will happen a lot, is actually inside Israel, so you can sort of see how small that strip is. But the Philistines are people that, if you know the Old Testament at all, they were often the enemies of the Israelites. They're kind of a mysterious group. We still aren't certain where they originally came from. They're known as the Sea Peoples. They seem to have come from around the Aegean. Maybe some people think they came from Crete and then came over here to the Levant. But they were definitely not Semitic, which is one reason the Hebrews, the Israelites, hated them even more than other people. But they were along that area, and the word Palestine comes from the Latin form of Philistina, which was apparently chosen by the Romans when they finally sort of crushed the Jewish revolts to name that area like Palestina, Syria, Palestina. It's partly to insult the Jews, naming that area after their traditional enemy. But if you're wondering, where those two words come in, and there are Palestinian Arabs who try to argue that they are descended from those people, in which case they would have historical claims, obviously going way, way back, long before the Arab Muslim conquest of that part of the world. I'll talk about that on another Sunday. But so the northern kingdom was taken, and go back to this map, but Judah survived until the 500s BC. Then they were conquered by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, also known as the Chaldeans, the Neo-Babylonians. And that's when they were taken into exile, by the rivers of Babylon. We wept when we remembered Zion, as it says in the Bible. But they were only in exile for less than a century, because by the end of the 500s BCE, the empire that took over from the Chaldeans was the Persian Empire. And again, I don't think I have anything about that on this list, but it's kind of ironic thinking about how Iran and Israel have about the worst relations of any country on earth. I mean, worse than the relationship with most of the Arab countries even, because the ancient Persians have a very good reputation in the Old Testament. Cyrus the Great let the Jews go back. He's the one who said, go back and, rebuild your temple, which had been leveled by the Chaldeans, Neo-Babylonians. And, the book of Ezra is about this. But finally, the Persian rule ended in 333 when Alexander the Great conquered that part of the world. So let me move on as fast as I can here. These are some other slides from other presentations I've done about Abraham. Of course, all three religions claim Abraham as their common father. And there, of course, is a view of Jerusalem. But this, Alexander the Great's empire fell apart almost immediately after he died, and it was divided up among his generals. And the only two here that you have to worry about, and these were called the Hellenistic kingdoms, was the one in Egypt, based mainly in Egypt, was named the Ptolemaic Empire because the general named Ptolemy was the man who first ruled that area. At times, particularly early in the story, they also ruled all this area of the Holy Land. But then the other even larger empire was the Seleucid Empire, which was based in Mesopotamia and Persia and so on. But the Seleucids and the Ptolemaic empires tended to be rivals and at times fought each other. And of course, this area was right sort of on the borderland. But you all know one Ptolemaic ruler, the last Ptolemaic ruler, very famous female. Yeah, Cleopatra was the last Ptolemaic ruler. But yeah, here you can see with the Seleucids, when you got down to like 188 or so, by about the year 200 BC, they had taken the Holy Land. And generally, they seem to be a bit more oppressive than the Ptolemaic governments had been. And in particular, what you finally get is a revolt that you all, I think, know about. Protestant Christians do not accept First and Second Maccabees as canonical books, but Catholics do. But generally Protestants know about the story, but they don't have it as a canonical book. But the story of these brothers, Judah Maccabeus and all, who led this revolt in the 160s against the Seleucid ruler. And according to at least the Jewish accounts, it's because this emperor was desecrating the temple, that he was trying to ban circumcision, all these other things, trying to force people to eat pork, set up a statue of himself in the temple and so on. So eventually there was a revolt that succeeded. And by 142 BC, you had what's called the Hasmonean dynasty, which you can see on there, and this is the last time Jews had their own state, sovereign state, until 1948. But it lasted for not even 100 years, I guess, but in 63 BC, the Hasmoneans were conquered by Pompey, great contemporary of Julius Caesar and Brutus. So starting in 63 BC, you began to have this area under Roman rule, of one sort or another. Eventually, they propped up a client king who was Herod the Great. We won't get into his whole story, but who was kind of sort of half Jewish. But he's, the one who built particularly Masada, which I'll get to in just a second. But finally, Rome started to take over directly by the year 6 AD, BCE, where Judea was placed under direct Roman administration. But I think all of you know that then there was a revolt by these people known as the Zealots, which is where we get the word for an extremist. But they were a sort of a branch of Judaism that you had the Pharisees and the Sadducees, but then the Zealots particularly just emphasized the need to have an independent Judea again. And they were, looking for the Messiah. Their conception of the Messiah was completely this sort of political conception that he will, be a great man appointed by God to lead us back into greatness. And obviously there were people in Jesus' time who wanted him to fulfill that role. And when Jesus said specifically, my kingdom is not of this world, he was basically renouncing the idea of what the Zealots thought. But the Zealots were very good at guerrilla warfare. The Romans nicknamed them the dagger people because they were very good at sneaking up on a Roman official or a soldier and stabbing them in a crowd, then getting away. And so already you can see sort of terrorism here, in the Middle East, which has a long history. The Romans certainly consider them terrorists. And one irony is, do you know what the Arabic word for zeal is? Because there's an organization whose name as a contraction forms the word in Arabic, zeal. But its name is actually the Islamic Resistance Movement. It's Hamas. That's Hamas. It works out wonderfully because it means zeal as well as an acronym. But finally, what happened, and this famous 19th century painting, that you had this revolt of the Zealots in the year 66. It went on for several years. Jerusalem fell, I think, in 70, which is what this painting represents. And the second temple, the one that had been rebuilt after the Persians let them return, it gets leveled. And of course, now all that's left is the West Wall, some people call the Wailing Wall, and the Temple Mount, which we'll get to in a second. But the final holdout was at Masada, which doesn't fall to the Romans till 73. Year 73. How many of you know roughly the story of Masada from one thing or other? There was a great made-for-TV movie about this back in around 1980. They had Peter O'Toole in it. But it was a fortress that Herod built out there. It's near the Dead Sea, up on this, this mesa. And it had these huge cisterns, and it does have them. So it was really able to withstand a siege for years. But the Romans finally built this huge, causeway mound to get it up next to this fortress. And there are conflicting stories now about what happened, but generally the narrative is there were about 900 people left in it, Zealots and their families, and they all collectively committed suicide rather than let the Romans take them. So the Romans, when they finally made their big attack in the morning, there was just this kind of eerie silence. And they're like, okay, where are these people? And they had all died by their own hand or by other people's hands helping them along. But Masada is extremely important in sort of the mythology, you might say, of Zionism, because some of you probably know this. When you enter the Israeli Defense Forces, and you know that both men and women generally have to serve in those forces, unless you are an Orthodox Jewish male, which you're exempt, which is very controversial in Israel. But but most people go through the military service. And the end of your basic training, the recruits are taken up on this top of this mesa, and there's a very dramatic ceremony where like Israeli jets fly over and they say that, you know, Masada will never fall again, sort of thing, you know, so they're commemorating all this. But whether that's completely healthy attitude, you know, again, I'll let the Israelis decide. But no, I mean, it was a very important Jewish American who died just a few months ago at the age of 100, Henry Kissinger, who of course was a German Jewish person. His family left before the Nazis started murdering everyone. But he of course was famous for negotiating the Middle East. At one point, he got very frustrated with Israeli intransigence about things. You know, of course, he was a fellow Jew, and he finally said, I think too many Israelis have a Masada complex, you know, that they would rather just commit sort of self-immolation than negotiate, or at least make any compromise, was the point he was making, I guess. So he found it frustrating. And yet there is a good response from one of the Israelis that he was dealing with when he said, you know, you people have a Masada complex. He said, yes, we do. We also have an Auschwitz complex and a Buchenwald complex and a Dachau complex, you know. So throw that card back at him. But anyway, but Rome got control over Judea, reasserted control by the early 70s. There was one last revolt, though, that I think is much less familiar to people, but it's really, in some ways, ultimately more important, and it is on your list. The first Jewish Roman War was, like I said, 66 to 73 when Masada fell. There was a second one early in the 100s that did not get very far. But the third Jewish Roman War, as it said, was in the 130s. And the leader of it was a man who eventually was known as Simon Bar Kokhba, which means, Bar Kokhba means, there's Masada again, means the son of a star. And this is the coinage that was issued during the year or two that he actually controlled most of Judea, and they got control of Jerusalem. That coin actually says, I think, or freedom for Jerusalem in Hebrew, the one on the right-hand side. But he apparently claimed to be the Messiah, and enough people believed that he was. And the Romans had a very hard time crushing this revolt. It was under Hadrian, of course, had the wall up in northern England now. But finally, that revolt was crushed by 136. And Simon Bar Kokhba apparently was not the Messiah, was killed. And then the Romans just said, okay, we've had it with these people. You know, of course, the Romans didn't understand why Jews were so resistant to them, because so much of the world, of course, the Mediterranean world, was conquered by Romans, and they generally kind of lived with it. But it was the distinctive religious nature of Judaism that made them not assimilate with the Romans, because almost all the other cultures that Rome conquered were also polytheistic, and they just didn't mind adding one more god to a pantheon. You know, if you have a bunch, and of course, the one they had to add was the Roman emperor, at least his genius. The Roman emperor was not supposed to be a god until after he died, but still, the way you showed your loyalty, I know a lot of you know this, is to, you had to drop some incense into a censer, into a burner, in front of an image of the current Roman emperor in a temple somewhere in your hometown. And that's all you really had to do. But you had to sort of show that I am acknowledging Rome's, you know, sovereignty. And for the Romans, it wasn't really about religion too much. It was about political loyalty. But the only people who just would not do that were the Jews. And then, of course, the Christians, who inherited that kind of, you know, Abrahamic stubbornness in it. And why the Christians were persecuted often, you know, fiercely under the Romans, is that unlike the Jews, the Christians were expanding. You know, they were proselytizing, but they also had this, you know, inability to accept, you know, the Roman emperor as a god. But the Romans finally they expelled virtually all the Jews in that area of the Holy Land, Palestine, Israel. A handful held on, and Zionists always point out that there was never a time when there was absolutely no Jewish presence in that part of the world, but it got to be very, very, very small percentage of the population. So the people that were living there after the 130s until the middle of the 20th century were various types of people. You know, it's of course a meeting place of a lot of different cultures, but it was under, you know, Roman rule, which then became a Christian empire that we eventually called the Byzantine Empire, you know, the eastern half. So for hundreds of years, it was under Christian emperors until the early 600s. Let me show you. But this is a Israeli stamp showing Simon Bar Kokhba. There's lots of plays about him and operas and things, but this is supposed to be Constantine's, the first Christian emperor's mother, Helena, who had a vision about where the the true cross was and where all these sacred sites for Christians were, but I'm not gonna, that's a whole nother series of lectures. But eventually, the place that she located is where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is built, where supposedly Jesus's grave was, burial spot was, the tomb. And it's not a particularly beautiful church, to be honest, particularly externally, but this is what it looks like on the inside. But this was obviously the church that was on the most sacred spot on earth to both Orthodox Christians and Catholic Christians once you started getting that division occurring. And some of you know the holy places there in Jerusalem are very contentious, not just about Jews and Muslims and Christians, but among the Christians. It's almost worse. That's another whole lecture too about the Ethiopian Orthodox have their section of the church, and then there's the Armenians have their section, the Eastern Orthodox have it. Anyway, the Presbyterians don't seem to want to claim one part or not, but it's like we have Scotland, it's like, but why it became sacred to Muslims is Muhammad, who obviously saw himself in the line of prophets that were mainly the Jewish prophets. All of you know this, I think, that Ibrahim, as they would call Abraham, they often call the first Muslim, because they said the word Muslim just means he who submits to the will of God. And they said that Abraham did that, and so he was the first Muslim. Jews obviously say you can't claim him, but Muhammad actually had his followers pray in the direction of Jerusalem early in his career, and then he changed it to Mecca for a lot of reasons. But this is a depiction, and normally, Islam does not have figurative art, but there are some traditions, particularly in Persia, that would depict animals and human beings, and even depict Muhammad, although usually they did like this picture where his face is kind of obliterated. But this is the so-called night journey. May have another picture of it. Yes, there you actually see his face. That's very rare in Muslim art. But there's a brief quotation, verse in the Quran that talks about God's prophet going to the furthest mosque, the one furthest away. And that's about all it says. They didn't even say it's Muhammad. But pretty quickly, the Muslim tradition in the Hadith, which is these accounts that come later, said that that prophet was in fact Muhammad, and that the furthest mosque was the spot at the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and that the miracle was that he was in Mecca, but then he was miraculously transported to Jerusalem, and then made this night journey. And often the stories had him on this kind of anthropomorphic horse-like creature called the burqa, called the lightning. But that's why if you see these pictures, he's riding on this thing. But that he got to the Temple Mount, he led a worship service, he being Muhammad, with Ibrahim and Musa, which is Moses, and Isa, which is Jesus, and then he ascended into heaven and was told some things, including the whole thing about the 5 times to pray. There's a really interesting story in the Hadith that he bargained with God, and that Moses kind of told him this, because Moses said, look, he wants you to pray, tell people pray 50 times a day. And he said, look, I know people, they're not going to pray 50 times a day. You got to tell God that it's got to lower. And this is, I'm not making this up. And so Muhammad told God, can we bring it down to something, and that God supposedly says, like, okay, you can make it, 10 times a day. But then he goes back and talks to Moses. Moses said, 10 is still too much. You got to go back. And so finally it gets down to 5. And supposedly Moses said, that's even too much. But Muhammad said, I'm not going to go back again. This is getting embarrassing. It's like, we're settling on 5. And there you go. And that, again, that's not in the Quran. But if y'all know, there's something called the Hadith, which are collections of stories by the companions, the early accounts about Muhammad. And a whole lot of what we think of as Muslim teaching are found in the Hadith, and that's one of them. But this whole thing about the night journey, and they say that the time it took him to miraculously go from Mecca to Jerusalem, have the night journey, come back to Mecca, to the people there, it's kind of like Einstein's theory of relativity. They experienced it as the time it takes for a door to open and to shut. It was that quick that no one really noticed he was even gone. But because of that, you have this thing, because the Dome of the Rock, probably the thing that stands out the most when you look at the old city of Jerusalem, was built over the spot where supposedly he had his ascent. And it was built in the end of the 600s. Jerusalem was conquered like the 630s, soon after Muhammad's death, by Umar, who was the second caliph. But there you can see it. And it's not a mosque. It is a shrine. The mosque is over, I'll show you here. That's the spot, the Holy Rock, but they've left obviously unfinished, uncarved or anything, where you can go in and see where this happened. And that's why Jerusalem is the third holiest city to Muslims, with Mecca being first and Medina second. It's a beautiful building. It's been restored at times by various Muslim rulers, including Suleiman the Magnificent. But you can see that thing in the foreground, that's the dome on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And so the Dome of the Rock was certainly meant to be kind of an answer to the Christian church, but they didn't tear it down, but it's kind of like, okay, but we're the people that really, the final truth of God is in our hands. And you can see it there, but I've got a lot of different pictures of it. But the mosque is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is right there. So this whole area on top of the Temple Mount, and that's right there, is the West Wall, the Wailing Wall. It's the only part left that Jews consider, left from the Second Temple. And there's another picture of it. I can spend forever, but this one shows it pretty well. Al-Aqsa means the furthest mosque. So you've got, the Western Wall here. You have the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is just like right down the block virtually. I mean, you have all these places that are of such importance within just a square mile, basically, of East Jerusalem. And that this is often where these riots begin, friction points begin, that there are obviously some of the more extreme Zionists who say we ought to tear down the Dome of the Rock and rebuild the temple, build the third temple on the Temple Mount. It's ours. Muslims put it there as a form of conquest to humiliate us. I think I may have one more picture of it. Yeah, there you can see the West Wall. They have a partition there because Orthodox Jews generally get to dictate how things like this happen, even though most Israelis are not Orthodox Jews. But part of it is that women have to be separate from the men. And I've had Jewish students who've been to Israel, and they were really upset that not just the segregation, but that the women get like 1/3 the size of the area where the men are. But I said, well, that's traditional religion. But there's some of this was taken, I think, after the 1967, after Israel took East Jerusalem. But then so it's important city for Muslims. But then the Crusades, of course, were about, above all, going and taking Jerusalem back, from the infidels, liberating the Holy Land. And briefly, they actually succeeded. I'm going to spend a lot of time on this. This is a Russian woman, which is, again, a different lecture. But have you ever wondered about why there's this Russian Orthodox looking church there in a lot of these pictures? Okay, well, I'll come back someday and talk about that if you want me to, about the connection between the Russian Empire and Jerusalem. But yeah, that definitely looks like it's been taken out of Moscow and dropped down in the middle of Jerusalem. But the Crusades, of course, were in the Middle Ages, high Middle Ages. From 1099 to 1187, it was actually in Western Christian hands, it being Jerusalem. But then Muslims took it back, and the Crusader kingdoms were finally eventually all done away with in the 1290s. So the crusading era of crusading kingdoms, at least, was about 200 years, about the 1090s to the 1290s. That's important to remember, in that Muslims in the world today tend to say, okay, Israel's there. It's been there now for, 75 years. But we're eventually going to undo it. The Crusaders were there for 200 years, but we eventually expelled them. And the same thing is going to happen to this Zionist entity, as they tend to call it. They don't want to call it Israel, but that remains to be seen. But this is a picture of the Ottoman Empire, because now we're getting down close to within 500 years of our century. The Ottoman Empire, which straddled 3 continents, they eventually took that area in the early 1500s. And it stayed under Ottoman rule until World War I, until really 1917. I'll go back to this one more time. And it was, largely a Muslim-ruled area, obviously, and more of the population there became Muslim. There's still obviously Palestinian Arab Christians, although they are, declined as a percentage mainly through immigration. But in terms of Jews, there were, like I said, this tiny community really of Jews that were hanging in there. And these are the 4 cities that became known as the 4 holy cities of Judaism. And this only dates back to like the 1500s, so kind of recent as far as that part of the world is concerned. But for different reasons, these 4 cities were considered sacred, but they got lumped together because they began to have a common sort of charity raising organization to raise money from people in the diaspora, which is where the vast majority, 95% of Jews were, to sort of maintain the Jewish communities in these four. And obviously, I don't think I tell you why Jerusalem is one of them, is number one. Hebron, does anyone know why that's the second holiest city? What's in Hebron, which is contentious because it's also important to Muslims and Christians. It's where the tomb of the prophets is. It's where they believe Abraham and Sarah are buried, and Isaac and Rebekah, and Jacob and Leah, but not Rachel for some reason, his favorite wife. But anyway, but that's the main reason Hebron. Safed here is a fascinating place up in the Galilee. It's the center of the Kabbalistic practice. You can see the other map. How many of you have a rough idea what the Kabbalah is? Because several years ago, it was like a lot of Hollywood people were kind of dabbling in it. A lot. Britney Spears for a while claimed she was practicing Kabbalah and then moved on. But it's, I'll show you a couple of pictures of it in just a second, but it's the highest point in the Galilee. And then Tiberias, which is around the Sea of Galilee, is where the Talmud was partly compiled, and it's the center of a lot of rabbinical learning and so on. But this is Safed. It's an interesting town. I've had, again, some students who've been there, but and it's even now it's considered sort of the center if you really get into the Kabbalah, which is a form of Jewish mysticism if you're not certain about what that is. And there are some of the streets, but again, during 5 more minutes again, that's a little drawing of them. I'm pretty sure that's supposed to be Jerusalem. That's Safed up on the top of the hill. This is Tiberias because it's down near the Sea of Galilee. Oops. And then that's Hebron. That's the tomb of the prophets. There was a horrible atrocity that occurred there. Many of you are old enough to remember in the mid-90s when an extremist American Zionist went in and just murdered a bunch of Muslims who were praying in the tomb of the prophets. Anyone remember that this? He killed like close to 20 people. Because what the Israeli government does is they have certain times of the day when Jews can go and worship and pray in the tomb of the patriarchs. I'm sorry, not the prophets. But then they also have a time set aside for Muslims. But this American Jewish immigrant went in and killed these people in prayer. It was about the same time when you had Rabin murdered by an extreme Zionist after they signed the Oslo Accords. But we'll get to that too. But this is a Presbyterian. I want to go ahead and jump to this before I have to start taking questions. No, I was talking to Jessica Wiener, who some of you know, who works at Harpeth Hall, who is Jewish, but she has come here at times because she has friends at Westminster. And I think she was even asked by someone, "Are you a Presbyterian?" And I was just talking with her a couple of days ago about something else. And I said, there is kind of a special connection between Jews and Presbyterian in some ways, because this guy is named Alexander Keith, who's on your list. Under Christian Zionists, about 2/3 of the way down. And then a guy named George Bush, not the one we all know and love. But both of them are Presbyterians. Keith was actually a Scot who was very interested in this question of Jews returning to, which of course now so many Protestants, particularly in America, think is so important. But he led a Church of Scotland, the Presbyterian Church inquiry to Palestine. He taught the Jewish communities on there. And he wrote a book in 1843 called The Land of Israel According to the Covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And he had an expression there that some of you probably heard, and most people think it was said by a Jewish Zionist, but it was said by a Scottish Presbyterian, that what you have here is a people without a land for a land without a people. How many of you have heard that phrase as a way of justifying Zionism? And obviously it's false. I mean, there were people there, Palestine was not empty. There were Arabs there who were mainly Muslims, some Christians. But this notion that, the Jews didn't have their own country land, which was true, but we can just put them in this land where it's basically empty. But he hoped that the British government would take steps to somehow allow Jews to sort of have a homeland there again. Now, of course, that was mainly based on the notion, just like a lot of evangelicals who support all this, that they will then convert to Christianity, and then that will be the next step towards the second coming and the end of the world and so on. There are definitely evangelical Protestants in America now who want to help extremist Jews blow up the temple, the Dome of the Rock, so you can rebuild and have the third temple. They said we can't have the whole apocalypse getting on its way until that's done, you know. So, and actually today, I would definitely say that among certain types of evangelical Protestants in America, they are more consistently and strongly Zionist than the American Jewish community is. You have plenty of American Jews who question all this, but evangelical Protestants now, I mean, there's like super Zionists, you know, from their own perspective. And Israelis realize that these people support them in part with the notion of eventually ending Judaism by having them convert to Christianity. And, you know, the Israelis are not stupid, but most of them say, look, if they're willing to help us in terms of American politics or come over here and give money or whatever, we can use all the friends we can get, you know, is their attitude. There are some Israelis who say, no, we shouldn't. But Alexander Keith, a good Scottish Presbyterian. And then this guy, this is George Bush, who was from Vermont, a Presbyterian professor of Hebrew at NYU. He wrote a book a year after Keith did called The Valley of Vision, or The Dry Bones of Israel Revived. And he also argued that, you know, that Christians and the British Empire particularly should try to help Jews return to, you know, to their homeland. But when I was talking to Jessica about this, and Lisa Hall, who was the two people I was talking with, I said, and they said, when I talked about this actually at a Methodist church, and they said, is there something about Presbyterians? Because both of these people were Presbyterians. And I said, I don't think it's purely coincidental, because the Calvinists, which is what Presbyterians were, at least, tend to be very pro-Jewish. You know, I mean, they're very Old Testament kind of Christians. That's why the Puritans named all their kids, you know, Abrahams and Isaacs and Jacobs and Rebeccas, you know. The idea of the covenant you just talked about before I started talking, so important in Presbyterian theology, you know. So I don't think it's a coincidence. You don't have, fortunately, a strong tradition of anti-Semitism among the Reformed Presbyterian churches. You do in the Catholic world, obviously. You do in the Lutheran world, because Luther ended up saying some very vicious anti-Semitic things. But that's one thing I think the Calvinists can say that they were not tainted by. Jews were let back into England in the mid-1600s after being expelled in the 1200s by Oliver Cromwell, you know, who was definitely a Calvinist Puritan. So I'm going to push this too. And then finally, just one last example. Amsterdam was one of the cities that had a thriving Jewish community for a long time. And the Dutch, of course, largely became Dutch Reformed Calvinists. And Jews knew that that was one place they could go. Rembrandt, a great Christian painter, went down and found Jewish friends to be his models for his biblical paintings. He said, look, you know, Jesus was not a Dutch person, you know, so I'm going to paint in the way he probably looked. It's why Otto Frank, along with his daughter Anne, why they fled to Amsterdam, you know, and unfortunately not far enough away from Nazi Germany. But anyway, so I'll make that case for the Presbyterians, but I maybe need to open up for questions, because we didn't even get to the 20th century. I didn't get to the 20th century, but I almost got there. Yeah, it's got middle of the 19th century.
I was going to say about the evangelical Christians' commitment. I remember when I was passing in Gulf, Georgia, bumper sticker that had Jerusalem, but the USA was in red, white, and blue.
Yes, no, I'm listening. I have a picture in here somewhere about that sort of thing. But you saw that in Georgia, you said? Yeah, it's pretty striking. We'll talk all about, you know, why some, yeah. Well, hey, I forgot it was actually Georgia. Georgia Federation of Christians for Israel. For Zion's sake, I will not keep silent. You know, in some parts of Europe now, there are people who are strongly pro-Zionist, mainly because they don't like Muslims, though. I'm not saying that's true for these people, but, you know, it's a way of showing your opposition to Islam. But
is that somebody who is says they're a Jew? Is it somebody who's going to a synagogue? Is it a DNA test?
that is an excellent question. And I do think when y'all ask questions, it makes me remember to say things I should have said, I meant to say. No, but that always comes up, obviously, with my students, because they think a Jew is a person who goes to a synagogue or a temple every Friday night or Saturday morning. And I said, no. I said, the majority of Americans who identify as being Jewish also then immediately say, but I'm not an observant Jew. Over half of them. So it's not obviously practicing religion exactly, but you can't say it's not connected with religion, because you identify culturally with Jews if at least at some point you had a parents or grandparents or someone in your family that did practice that religion, but then you have all the cultural and historical, you know, you can say culinary things that, you know, relate to being Jewish. And those people would be adamant that I am in fact very much Jewish, but that I don't practice religion. I don't keep the kosher laws and things like this or a strict Sabbath, but I am very much Jewish. And then, of course, the bigger problem in some ways for Jews is that anti-Semites will say someone's Jewish whether they're practicing the religion or not. Like when the Nazis were rounding up people and sending them to death camps, it didn't matter that you had converted to Christianity or if even your great-grandparents had converted. They thought it was a biological thing. We don't think that, it's not, there's no Jewish chromosome or something, but it's just one of the most complicated questions in the world is what is a Jew? And in fact, Hitler was even asked that, like, okay, we're killing these people because they're supposed to be Jewish. What is a Jew? And he finally said, a Jew is anyone I say is a Jew. But, they had their ways of saying if you had like 1/8 Jewish heritage, but that just begs the question, what makes that 1/8, that great-grandparent Jewish? So my answer is I can't give you a very good answer, but it's so important because I think a lot of, when we get to the creation of Israel next time, I think so many Americans think that it was all about religion because it does have a flag that has, Mogen David and stuff. But when Americans go there, they're often shocked about how many Israelis are really very irreverent about religion because they kind of resent the Orthodox Jews that try to impose things on them. And that, the father of Israel, most people would say, the modern father, is Theodor Herzl. He stopped going to any religious services after he was no longer a child. He didn't even bar mitzvah his son, which most Jews do, even if they don't, it's kind of like Christmas Christians. He didn't know Yiddish or Hebrew. In fact, one of his friends said, Herzl doesn't know anything about Jews. And yet he's, we'll see how he becomes the father of modern Israel. But so it's complicated, but that's a really good question. I gave a really rambling answer. But another question, you need to tell me when we just need to stop because we all had to head on. Yeah.
I appreciate you all being here. If we can thank Art for being here with us. Thank you, thank you. And we are working very hard, recognizing that March is a crazy time. So 4 Sundays, I am not even going to be here next Sunday, but it is going to be Zoomed and it's going to be recorded. But we do hope that as many of you will continue on this journey with us through the next 4 Sundays. Art will be here leading us into century by century. Hopefully we'll get eventually to October 7th. But thank you so much. If we can bow our heads, please. Loving God, during this Lenten season, open our ears and our hearts. We know that through knowledge, we develop empathy. Through empathy, we are transformed to share your love, your understanding, and to promote reconciliation in difficult times. Thank you, God, for walking this walk with us, for your still voice and your love. In your name we pray. Amen.